This is Watcher Chronicles, another game that's going for the whole 2D Souls-like thing, and I wasn't actually planning on doing another one of these so soon after I just covered Lost Epic, but this one just kind of came out of nowhere to me. It caught my eye because of how it looks and things, and I wanted to go ahead and take a look at it because it seemed like a relatively short experience that would be fun to look at in between much larger releases. As far as how it looks, that's kind of the first thing to talk about, because the art style is going for something very specific. Now, I have to admit that this art style doesn't really do much for me personally, but I do sort of appreciate it. Even though it's not really my thing, I do have a certain amount of nostalgia for this art style, I have to admit, because it is basically like 2005 Newgrounds Flash animation art style. And like I said, this isn't really my thing anymore, but there's a certain amount of nostalgia for this visual style, and the game does do a pretty good job of actually realizing it. It is very colorful, which is an interesting departure from a lot of these games. A lot of Souls-like games that follow this formula, they go for a very gritty, dark fantasy look, where everything is very desaturated and gray and grisly and grim, but this is very bright and colorful, which is fun, at least. And even though the art style isn't my thing, I do have to also admit that the actual background details are really nice. The sort of parallax scrolling backgrounds in each area tend to look really good and have a lot of, they add a lot of atmosphere to the regions, especially the areas that have things like gigantic demons impaled that are like the size of mountains and stuff in the background. It's a nice look. I think it, like I said, it does a good job of realizing this colorful sort of Newgrounds Flash animation art style that it's going for. As for how the world itself works, it's pretty expansive. There's quite a lot to find in each direction, and they are actually split up into leveled areas, which is interesting. That's very unusual for a Souls-like to actually define levels like that. But in this case, when you go to the statues that you use as bonfires, your sort of checkpoint areas, you can warp around from the beginning of the game, and when you warp to an area, it tells you the level of that area. But I've noticed that the level is pretty vague, because what the level really represents is around the average level that you would want to be to start it, basically, whereas it does get more difficult than that later on, and you'll tend to find that the bosses, especially the optional bosses and the final boss of each level, are pretty difficult compared to what the level might make you think. So the level recommendations are really just sort of vague suggestions, more so than any sort of hard limit. I have also noticed that the map works in kind of a strange way. At first, it's laid out like you would expect a sort of Metroidvania 2D sort of map to look, except it only loads the area that you're currently in, which is very odd. So if you want to look for locked doors and things like that, or missed chests in other areas, you have to actually warp to those areas to get their maps to load. That's a little strange and kind of frustrating, again, when you're looking for things that you may have missed, but it's relatively easily remedied since you can warp around from the beginning of the game, just warp to the area that you want to look in. The character building system is pretty simplified in this game. You could call it streamlined, but I think simplified also works in this case because these games are often known for having a lot of character build variety. This one, not so much, although not to the point that it's like a severe weak point, just that at first you won't have a whole lot of variety to work with because the game really backloads a lot of its interesting spells and equipment and stuff like that. They do exist in the game, you just have to wait a little while before finding them. And you have 4 different stats to level up. You have strength, vitality, dexterity, and focus. So this means that you only actually have 1 damage stat for each type of combat. Strength is your melee damage stat, and focus is your magic damage stat. Dexterity is not a damage stat at all. It's actually a crit chance stat for the most part, although some of the armors also scale with dexterity in terms of their physical protection, and vitality is of course just your health gauge. So that means the character builds are very simple in this game, so if you've ever felt that some of these games are a little bit too complex for you, if the idea of seeing one of those like the Dark Souls level up screen just makes your eyes glaze over from all the information that's on it, then something that's a lot more streamlined like this might just be for you. Personally, I'm the kind of person that likes to dig really heavily into character builds and things, so this is a little bit simple for me, but it still does its job pretty well, and that links into the combat itself. The combat and equipment system is actually also pretty simple. You have 1 armor that you wear, it's all 1 armor slot. You also have 3 ring slots, as well as a primary and secondary weapon slot. And you have a single sort of normal attack combo for your primary weapon, as well as some attacks in the air, and you also have a charge attack for it. And your secondary weapon is usually something like either a bow or a spell. They all have just a quick shot from tapping the button. You can also hold bows down to aim them, and you can hold spells to charge them, and expend more energy but let loose a more powerful version of the spell. All of your primary attacks take stamina, as does rolling, of course, and all of your secondary attacks, whether they be spell or bow, take energy, that purple bar up there, and energy is mostly regained by just doing normal primary attacks, so this means that you don't have to worry about something like mana or ammo for your weapons. Instead, you just have this constantly recharging bar that you use instead. You also have a classic charge-based healing system where you can carry a different number of health potions along with you, and you can of course find potion pouches that allow you to eventually carry more. These represent heals and they recharge every time you go back to a statue. One interesting thing about the healing in this game is it seems to scale by itself. Rather than like having an Estus flask +4 or whatever, instead of upgrading the flask itself, it always seems to heal a sort of a specific percentage of your HP, which means when your HP goes up, the amount it heals automatically goes up with it. So this means it's pretty much always competitive, although there is a ring that makes each one heal more. You don't have to worry about upgrading your flasks separately. They just sort of do that as you get stronger. You also have a dodge roll, of course, and you can dodge at just the right time, and the game will let you know when you've done this because it will actually slow down for a second, which is a nice touch, and it will actually refund some of the stamina that you use to dodge when this happens. You can also parry. You have a block button, although it is mostly a parry button because you can't just hold it to block for as long as you want. Instead, when you press it, you just sort of do a small parry animation and then hold the block for another second or so before automatically stopping again. So it's meant to be timed with enemy hits to try and parry them as effectively as possible. Parrying refunds stamina as well, as long as you do it successfully, and it also allows you to get a more powerful hit in at the start of a combo. The exploration is actually pretty fun because the world is quite large and there's a lot to explore. There's a lot of shortcut finding and stuff, which I always appreciate. You know, instead of having a bunch of statues in each area, there's generally only one or two big statues and sort of a nexus area, and then a whole bunch of shortcuts that you'll unlock that go back to the statue as you actually get farther and farther into the area, like unlocking gates or activating elevators and things like that. This means that for the most part the areas feel quite well designed, and designed in such a way that navigating them isn't difficult or annoying. They flow together quite nicely, and they're generally pretty easy to remember where everything is, which is nice since, as I mentioned, the map doesn't show you absolutely everything. And they're fun to explore, to find all of the hidden chests and the secret areas and the hard enemies and stuff like that. It does a good job of encouraging you to explore because of how little equipment variety you actually have at first. You want to explore for everything because every chest that you find has a chance to include some new weapon or new spell or something like that that's going to help you out. So you definitely want to find this stuff to increase the amount of build variety that you have available to you. It also uses a classic Souls-like system called Umbra. You mostly get Umbra from killing enemies, and when you die, you lose your Umbra in a big bag on the ground, and you have to go back to where it was to retrieve it. This all works pretty much exactly like you would think. So far, so simple. It is a Souls-like that is kind of going through the paces of what this genre tends to do, and doing it in a pretty fun art style. However, where we start to run into problems is in where the game tries to focus its gameplay, and in my opinion this game has two kind of large overarching problems that drag it down a little bit, and it's what it tends to focus on versus what it's actually good at. For one, this game has a pretty large focus on platforming and aerial combat, and in my opinion it's not very good at it, so I don't really know why it focuses on it so much, because it's actually, it drags the exploration down a little bit when in almost every single area of the game there will be at least one, oftentimes multiple sections that are just a series of very narrow platforms way up in the air, where there are a ton of enemies resting and you just have to jump in between each one. It kind of makes the exploration feel a little bit bogged down, a little bit padded out, when the rest of the areas are so well made, and then you will inevitably come across these giant ravines filled with platforms that just crash the pacing of the game way down. It's a real problem because there will always be an enemy or two on the very edge of each platform just waiting for you to jump up there. And you can dodge in midair, which is appreciated, but still, if you get hit at all on these platforms, it tends to send you way off, falling to your death. So these platforming sections tend to go into the you have to be pixel perfect with your landings and attacks, or else you instantly die territory, and it makes them a lot less fun. And the aerial combat of this game is just kind of floaty and not all that enjoyable, so it makes these sections a bit of a slog to get through. This is compounded by the fact that the fall damage in this game is really, really strange, and that it doesn't technically have fall damage per se. It's weird. Either you will fall and take absolutely no damage at all, or you will fall and instantly die. There is no middle ground. You don't just take damage from falling. There's no like scaling amount of damage that you take depending on the height. Instead, you will either fall and remain perfectly unscratched or die instantly, and those are your only two choices. And I actually tested this myself, and the difference between a fall that you survive with 100% health and a fall that insta-kills you is about the height of your jump. Just one jump's height worth of fall is the difference. Because there's one area where these two platforms are quite high up in the air. I fell off of the lower platform and survived perfectly intact. I then jumped up to the higher platform, fell off, and died. So there's something weird with the fall damage in this game that makes these aerial combat platforming sections even more frustrating than they need to be because of how weird the fall damage is. I think where this game shines in its combat is in its ground mass combat, where there are a ton of kind of fodder enemies and then some more elite dangerous enemies for you to face all on the ground. And it does a really good job of that feeling of cleaving through crowds while also picking out the more powerful enemies to face individually. It's a fun combat system. It's simple, but it's fun, and it does its job really well. So I feel like it should focus more on that and less on these really annoying platforming sections that aren't as fun as its normal sort of mass ground combat is. And the other problem I have is with its difficulty and the way that it does its boss fights. So you expect a game like this to be relatively challenging, and I have to say that this game, as far as if you compare it to like other 2D Souls-likes, like say Blasphemous or Salt and Sanctuary, this is not as difficult as one of those games. However, do you remember, and I'm sorry for making you remember this, the Shrine of Amana from Dark Souls 2? The very pretty area that had those priestesses that shot tons of homing projectiles at you from like halfway across the observable universe. That place. The really annoying part of that place actually wasn't the projectile spam, because they were relatively slow moving and easy to roll through. It was those knights, those guys that had seemingly infinite stamina that could just attack and attack and attack forever and never stop. Well, about half of this game's bosses have that problem. It turns the boss fights into sort of an annoyance when they often just are constantly infinitely attacking from the second the boss fight starts until it ends. This means that dodging is actually not a good idea, because if you dodge, you get some stamina back, but only about half of the stamina that a dodge takes if you perfectly dodge an attack. This means that after a couple of dodges, you will run out of stamina, and the boss will still be attacking you, and you will be standing next to the boss with no stamina left to break out of an attack, therefore you will get infinite comboed to death instantly. This basically means that you have to perfect parry almost everything a boss does in order to try and interrupt them, but the problem with this is they often can attack so fast and so repetitively that even perfect parrying over and over again will still eventually run you out of stamina, and when you do run out of stamina, like I said, you'll be standing next to the boss with no stamina left, which means you get infinite comboed. I've actually had a couple of times where this has happened, where I've actually done a really good job of parrying every single blow that came my way and trading blows with the boss, but eventually I just ran out of stamina. That was all that I could parry, and the boss still had enough stamina left to infinite chain combo me to death without me being able to break out of it once I actually did run out. So this means that the boss fights in this game only seem to have two forms. Either they are a character that's more like you, that has a weapon and a secondary weapon and stuff like that, and they do a lot of the things that you can do, and these bosses, in my opinion, are actually the best ones in the game because they're actually quite interesting. They tend to have quite a varied moveset, a lot of attacks to learn, and they don't just spam a couple of basic attacks and kill you no matter what. And then there's the other bosses that do exactly that. They have a lot fewer attacks to do, but they just spam them repeatedly until you die. And this, in my opinion, is not the definition of difficulty. I do not like this definition of difficulty, at least. It is not hard, it's just obnoxious. You know, it's not super challenging to overcome a boss that only has 3 or 4 attacks, but uses them infinitely with seemingly no stamina limitation and can never stop, and also has hitboxes that are gigantic and outrange you all the time, so you basically have to try and get lucky with the hitboxes in order to actually get a hit in. That's not a fun challenge to me, and it's kind of a shame that so many of the bosses seem to devolve into this problem of a mix of wonky large hitboxes and infinite spam attacks. Now, I wouldn't say that either of these problems, the spammy bosses or the over-presence of very small platforms way up in the air where there's instant death all the time, ruin the game. I wouldn't say that either of those make this a bad game at all, but I would say that it is a relatively simple experience, so when you have these more complex flaws on top of what the simple combat does well, it does kind of drag it down a bit, and it makes the boss fights pretty much my least favorite part of the game, and also it makes those platforming sections my least favorite part of the exploration, because the exploration and the combat both have really good aspects. They focus very well on exploring for chests and hidden equipment, and on fighting large groups on the ground. So it's kind of a shame that it decides to focus a little bit too much, in my opinion, on the platforming and the super spammy bosses, when neither of those things are actually as fun as what else it does. But that's my look at Watcher Chronicles. I think it evens out to being a pretty enjoyable game, with some fun exploration, some fun combat. It just has a lot of frustrating elements that make me think that it could have used some extra design passes to nail down some of these more kind of spammy bits that don't necessarily need to be there. But it is a very simple experience, so it's something to pick up if you've played a lot of these games like Blasphemous, like Salt and Sanctuary, and are looking for something else to tide you over until Elden Ring inevitably makes us all fall off the face of the earth. So that is Watcher Chronicles. I will, of course, put the link to the Steam page in the description below this video. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.